Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ari Chickerl, Junta's Associate Director of Foreign Policy. We have a very timely webinar today about the ongoing U.S. strikes targeting the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen and the Houthis' continued attacks in the Red Sea against Israel. I'm happy to be joined by a panel of experts with extensive military experience in the Middle East. Retired Lieutenant General Thomas Bergeson is the former Deputy Commander of U.S. Central Command. Retired Lieutenant General Joseph Costella is the former Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations of the U.S. Air Force and was the commander of U.S. Air Force's Central Command. Retired Vice Admiral Kevin Donegan was the former Director of Navy Staff and Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations, Plans, and Strategy, and was commander of U.S. Naval Central Command, U.S. Fifth Fleet Combined Maritime Forces. Before we begin the conversation with the panel, Junta released an update on our website yesterday with data and analysis on the U.S. and the Houthi strikes. Nolan, can we bring up chart one? As you can see on this chart, the increase in the scale, scope, and persistency of U.S. military operations against the Houthis has been clear since the U.S. began the ongoing strikes against the Houthis in Yemen on March 15th. Based on Junta's data, the United States launched 423% more strikes during its current operations against the Houthis in March 2025 alone, compared to all of the operations that it conducted against the Iran-backed terrorist group from November 2024 to February 2025. The more than 89 strikes that the United States has already launched against the Houthis this month alone have surpassed the total of any month since February 2024. The roughly 47 strikes that the United States launched on March 15th, when these operations began, marked the single largest day of operations against the group since the strikes began in January 2024. After launching no strikes against maritime targets this year, the 12 projectiles that the Houthis launched during its attacks against U.S. Navy ships on March 16th marked the largest single Houthi attack since November 2024. Before that, the Houthis had not launched an attack against ships or Israel since December, as I said, until they launched their attacks this past week, and instead had been firing surface-to-air missiles against U.S. drones and, for the first time, U.S. aircraft. According to Junta's data, the Houthis have launched at least 683 missiles and drones against maritime targets since the Iran-backed terrorist group began their escalation in October 23 after Hamas's invasion and attack against Israel on October 7th. Nolan, can we bring up chart two? Great. After starting to strike the Houthis on March 15th, the Trump administration has continued daily strikes against the group compared to, if you look at the chart, it notes that the Biden administration was launching operations on an average of every 3 days. And then if you also can note on the chart, the Biden administration had been more active against the Houthis early in 2024, but between October 2024 and until the end of the administration in January 2025, it significantly lowered the tempo of its attacks on the terrorist group to about one operation every 2 weeks. So, Nolan, if you could bring down those charts. And with that background in mind, I want to turn to the panel. You can find those charts, the update that we released yesterday, as well as Junta's Iran projectile tracker on our website. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please submit them through Zoom. And Admiral Donegan, I'll start with you. I mentioned the Houthis and the aggression that they've been waging, but if you could start us off with some background. Who are the Houthis? How do their objectives pose risks to U.S. forces, partners, and our interests in the region?
Hey, Ari, thank you. First, thanks to Junta for inviting me to join this panel. Honored to be linked up with the esteemed colleagues that are on here today and talk a little bit about what's going on. Yeah, question is a great one to start because I think when you look at this in the grand scheme, people lose sight of the fact that the Houthis aren't a legitimate government. They're not. They aren't the recognized government of Yemen. What they are is they're, by religious background, they're a Shia group, but they're rebels and they're a mountain tribe, originally a mountain tribe from the northern part of Yemen, north of Sana'a. They took advantage back in early 2000 when they started to fight against the then president or rebel against the president of Yemen. His name was Abdullah al-Saleh. And then because they wanted greater autonomy and, in government, etc. And then in 2014, because of some very weak moves that the Yemeni government made, they became vulnerable, and the Houthis basically did an assault, disposed the government, and moved and took over a fairly large portion of the western area of Yemen, and actually forced then the acting president, who was Mr. Hadi, to flee the country. So what they are is a regional actor, but they have much greater ambitions. And to be frank, they're a regional actor that's absolutely supported, backed, and given the capabilities that they have to conduct what they're doing from Iran. So number one, I think we need to look at them and understand that they are not the recognized government of Yemen. And number two, they are basically insurgents, and that they're backed and supported tremendously by Iran in terms of where they get their capabilities, their training, their ability to conduct these actions in the Red Sea. So without Iran, they'd still have some capability, but nowhere near necessarily the range, nowhere near the weapon systems and the ability to do that. Now, tactically, you asked about the risk to U.S. forces. Uh, the risk to U.S. forces that we see going on today in the Red Sea are that if you look at another one of the trackers that you guys put out, you actually can kind of see a large number of the attacks that they've been doing have been launches where they say they've been launched at U.S. forces in the region, and we can talk about what that means later if you want. But the risk to U.S. forces are if you're on geographically, the Red Sea is a body of water that sits below the Suez Canal. Think of it as the southern gateway to the Suez Canal. It's not very wide, it's pretty narrow. And therefore, if you drive a ship either north through there or south through there, you have to be in close proximity to Yemen, especially as you transit the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. And what that means is U.S. forces in that region, anytime we're moving our ships through, they're very short amount of time to react to uh, what the Houthis can shoot at them. And they shoot drones, they shoot cruise missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles. They have surface drone ships and even some subsurface capability, we believe, to attack ships in the region. So what it does is gives our forces very little time to react. And as you showed in those charts, we haven't been doing much offense. We've been playing defense for over a year. And when you put any kind of military force in a position where all they get to do is play defense and they can't take out the forces that are attacking them, it means that our Navy sailors, our Marines, and those that are in those waters, it puts them at great risk because they have to, in just seconds, be able to defend against that array of weapons that can be thrown at them, and they have to do that 24/7, 365, or anytime they're in the envelope. So the tactical risk to the U.S. forces is very large if we stay in a defensive only approach to how we're dealing with the Houthis.
You mentioned the chart Chinsa has of Iran-backed attacks against U.S. forces. You can also find that chart on our website. But you mentioned the risks to U.S. forces. So with those risks, why is the U.S. there? Why are Middle Eastern waterways important to the United States? And what do the restrictions on the freedom of navigation that the Houthis had posed mean to global commerce?
Yeah, it's a great question because you can see a difference in how this administration is framing what we're doing in the actions in the region. As opposed to trying to contain a conflict, this administration has been very clear that what we're doing now is to restore what's called the freedom of navigation or free flow of commerce through the Red Sea. And why is it important? Because the Red Sea, 12 to 15% of the world trade goes through the Red Sea. Okay, what does that mean? That's 12% of the oil. It's 8% of the liquid natural gas. It's 30% of container shipping traffic. So almost 1/3 of container shipping traffic that moves across the globe is going through the Red Sea in a normal setting. And 40%, not half, but 40, almost a little over 40% of the European Asian trade flows through there. So what's happened as a result of when the Houthis began these attacks, the shipping companies voted with their feet. They didn't want to put their ships at risk, and all the major shipping companies are diverting now around the Cape of Good Hope, which adds a tremendous cost. It adds almost 2 weeks to the transit time. So we've seen a 50% reduction in flow of traffic through the Red Sea and a 50% increase going around Africa. But in reality, all of the big shipping companies are not going through. It's only local and smaller traffic that's going through the Red Sea. The problem that puts us in, Ari, is that there's no more shock absorbers left in the global supply chain. When when the Houthis began these attacks, we had an excess capacity in oil carriers and an excess capacity in freight carriers. Those are all being used up by the current conflict. So any other perturbation in the global supply chain will have direct impact on the economy here. And I'll just close by saying we know this as a nation, but not only do we know, the European nations know this. And for the last 4 decades, keeping free flow of commerce through waterways like this has been a core vital interest of the United States. Matter of fact, even President Biden's national security strategy said U.S. will not allow foreign or regional partners to jeopardize the free flow of commerce through Middle East waterways, including the Straits of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb. There's a similar statement in NATO's strategic concept for 2022. And if you look at even more broader than Europe and the U.S., there's 46 nations in a maritime coalition in the Middle East now who have one job, and that's to keep free flow of commerce moving on. And that's how important it is to all nations to have freedom of navigation and free flow of commerce. So we're fortunate, is what I'm saying, that we had some capacity to absorb the closure, almost complete closure of the Red Sea in this situation. But there's no more shock absorbers left in the global supply chain.
General Guastella, how did the United States respond to the Houthis during the Biden administration, and how did those efforts succeed or fail?
Well, I think your charts kind of show it really well. They had that initial surge to try to knock down some of their capability, but then they really waned off. And so the answer is they failed. But what Admiral Donegan just stated right there, the fact that we've allowed a rogue government, a rogue people to affect global shipping to this extent, and frankly, do just barrages against U.S. vessels flowing through that region is astonishing, and to generate that much air effects against Israel is I've been astonished by that. And so and and in the fact that I think I can't, I wasn't involved in the policy making that decided this, but I think what we see here is more Middle East fatigue from the last administration, where they just don't want to get into it. And like we finished up 2 wars over there in the Middle East, where obviously ISIS is still going on just to a very low extent, but just the thought of cranking up again in another country, I think the administration just didn't have the guts to do it, even though we've already described what it's doing to international shipping. And so we found ourselves in a really lame predicament. I will say one thing: the Houthis are not ISIS. They're not a rogue organization. They are very smart, and they're very well equipped by Iran. And so that's why they've been successful. The technology they have is not amateurish. It is some pretty decent stuff, and they've done a pretty good job of keeping it alive on the ground. And so they're not a Class C adversary. They're pretty respectable in many respects, and so but they've been allowed to be that way, and they've benefited tremendously from Iran, and so to answer your question, the last administration did not do very much. There may have been some linkages to the peace talks in Gaza that they wanted to tamp down and to not really prosecute and allow that to play out. I don't know, but there's certainly more that can be done.
I'm glad you raised Iran and the Houthis' capabilities. I definitely want to come back to that in a moment because it's certainly a crucial part of all of this. But first, General Bergeson, we've touched on it a little bit how the current campaign is different, but want to get your thoughts on what you see currently going on and how it's distinct from what the U.S. had been doing previously, and what you see as the U.S. current objectives and prospects for succeeding at those objectives.
Yeah, thank you. So let me start with just some context on, the interests of the United States in Yemen starting post 9/11, because we've been there for a while, but for different reasons. So post 9/11, when we were trying to, root out Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, had a safe haven basically down in Yemen, in part driven by the civil war and kind of lack of ungoverned spaces. So back, in the early, 2000s, we had special operations forces with boots on the ground in Yemen for the purpose of gathering mostly human intelligence and other kinds of intelligence for strikes against AQAP. Think like the underwear bomber, if you remember that guy. There were several that were operating in that region because of just, again, a lack of good governance, if you will. It wasn't necessarily there. We weren't there at all to participate or take sides in the civil war, even though we knew the Houthis were bad people doing bad things. They weren't really a direct threat to the United States like AQAP was. Post the killing of Osama bin Laden and kind of the tamp down of Al Qaeda and AQAP in general, those forces were moved out of there, and we had no longer any kind of U.S. forces gathering that day-to-day intelligence. When I was deputy commander of CENTCOM, it was the Bush 1 administration, so if we go back to that, and clearly. What started to shift was the direct support the Iranians were providing to the Houthis for the purposes Saudis and the Emiratis and other regional partners in that region. So there began a series of multiple strikes that the Houthis would do throughout the region, to include getting close to the airport. I think it was Abu Dhabi, maybe it was Dubai, but and then the Riyadh airport as well, but not attacking directly U.S. forces, even though we thought they might have the capability. It set up a vexing problem for the partners in that region because they had limited air defenses that were mostly focused on Iran. And when you've got to now cover your southern flank, you can't pivot a Patriot 360 degrees, right? So you had to pick your poison there a little bit. And so the Saudis were obviously engaged with a coalition of their own, with the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and some others to try to strike the Houthis and to mitigate, this threat to their region. The U.S., we militarily wanted to provide some kind of support because the Saudis were very nascent in their capability for doing things like find, fix, and finish targets. That's something we do in the United States very well, gathering intelligence, pinpoint accuracy, and delivering the right weapon. They weren't very good at it, and so they had some misfires where they, killed some civilians that obviously got a lot of press. But politically, there was bipartisan position in the United States that the U.S. will not get involved in a civil war in Yemen. It was seen as a huge humanitarian problem, a lot of famine that was happening, and we were not supporting the Saudis in any way, shape, or form, in part driven by the Khashoggi. I can't understate how important that was in the relationship with the United States. So even under the first Trump administration, while we had capabilities to go strike against the Houthis, and General Guastella and his team worked on it regularly, we just didn't do it, because there was no political willpower on the United States' part to go participate in what looked like a Saudi problem with their Houthi neighbors. So fast forward to now, what changed obviously is the Houthis are starting to attack U.S. forces and shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb, right, and really have this big time impact. And so our interest has completely changed now about the importance of attacking the Houthis. It's similar to the Somali pirate problem that happened. Obviously, Somalis were less violent in some ways, but it was a similar coalition of the willing that got together to try to tamp down and did so successfully. But the Somali pirates didn't have surface-to-surface missiles and undersea capabilities to go after shipping, so it's much more dangerous. We've routinely interdicted, with the Fifth Fleet assets, Iranian shipping into Yemen and have published the pictures of the different missiles and things that they're bringing in, mostly by sea in small boats, but also by land through Oman. The U.S. government has put pressure on the Omani government to try to shut down some of those passageways through Oman that we know are happening from Iran. But it's still hard. We know we're not going to get everything that's going to flow into Yemen, and they're beginning more and more higher end capabilities than they have historically. So break now, what's the U.S. interest? Obviously, is to have freedom of navigation and then a very important waterway. It's not just the United States problem. It's a huge coalition, as the Admiral talked about, to do it. And so now there's a willingness and a political will to go strike them. But they've been there for a long time. Again, it's what's changed is part because what their tactics are, the threat to us, as well as now our ability to do it. But what we lack is the human intelligence that we used to have. So we're using a lot of probably overhead and other kinds of intelligence to find these networks and interdict to the extent we can the shipping that goes in there, and then to strike the locations where we think they're storing the weapons, as well as to try to kill the archers. When we see them shoot, now we can find them, but you're shooting behind the duck a little bit, right? When you're doing that, because you have to, take the incoming fire and then try to kill the guy who's shot. But we're probably, it's going to be hard to continue to do target development without some slightly more exquisite intelligence. And I think human intelligence is going to be really important to get to really be able to hit the networks that are the most important. I think that's why strategically the president is now pushing a lot of pressure on Iran, kind of calling them out finally. Again, we've known about that, but publicly we just haven't said that Iran was involved, in part because we didn't want to get involved when we thought it was a civil war and a Saudi problem, but now we are. And so you see a lot more talk about putting pressure on Iran, which I think is hugely important here, to try to cut down the flow. We're probably putting pressure on Oman again, I guarantee, to try to again flow this from the land, GLOC, the ground line of communication, and then interdiction operations with Fifth Fleet and other assets to try to interrupt anything that's flowing over by sea there. So a lot of targets that we're hitting. And it's what I would call a punishment campaign more than a denial campaign. We're trying to up the cost of their activities by just striking these key targets. But until we're able to take out the network of kind of key leaders here that are involved, which really needs human to be able to do that, I think it won't be completely satisfying to us. Break over.
As a follow-up, we have a question from Vice Admiral John Miller. It's not that we are conducting strikes against the Houthis, it's what we are striking. Do we think the latest round of strikes is impacting Houthi centers of gravity? So General Bergeson, I'll pose that to you.
Oh, I mean, centers of gravity is a nice Clausewitzian concept, and it's hard to perhaps find what the center of gravity is there, right? Right now, we're just trying to, as it appears to me, and again, I don't have the updated intelligence on the exact targets we're striking, but we're trying to be cost imposing to them. If we find a warehouse that we believe has stuff, we're going to take that out. We're just trying to minimize their capabilities and make them think twice about going out and shooting and strike fear into the archer's heart that if they do shoot, they're going to get killed. But I don't know that it's necessarily going after the center of gravity, which perhaps lies in Iran in this case. So I think there's more work to be done.
Admiral Donegan, on a similar note, if we're talking about imposing costs, does the U.S. need to severely degrade the Houthis' capabilities to deter them and impose that cost, like what Israel did to Hezbollah? Or can we strike them, hard and fast enough to stop them from launching missiles and drones before needing to reach that kind of an extensive campaign?
Hey, thanks, Sarah. That's probably the $60 million question out there, right? What's the end here, right? How can we get there? To jump back to Admiral Miller's question for a minute, and I agree everything that General Bergeson said. What we're not hearing is the administration talk today specifically about what we're targeting, and I'm glad they're not, to be honest. I mean, for a lot of different reasons, I think that needs to be held. You don't tell the enemy what you're going to do, and you don't tell them what you're not going to do. And I think that's super important. But to get to your question, Ari, first, the Houthis are deterrable. Iran's deterrable, and I can give you examples in history. In both cases are true. The Houthis are also absolutely defeatable. However, that requires a will, it requires a commitment, and requires resources and time, right? And why do I say they're defeatable? Because if you go back in time, and it was mentioned earlier, we had Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that existed for a long time in the ungoverned spaces in Yemen, and we were successful at basically eradicating that threat, but it didn't happen overnight. It was a prolonged campaign with super intelligence that we had as we went along. On top of that, the Houthis watched all that. They learned from that, right? And that comment about what they learned means they understand how we do those things, and they understand how to protect their resources, and they're pretty good at protecting their resources. So what I think I hear the administration saying by centering and clearly centering this on free flow of commerce and freedom of navigation is that we're moving this campaign in the direction of more of a network type takedown as opposed to just going after the capabilities and doing it sporadically or episodically. In other words, we're going to build an understanding not just of where the capabilities are, a deeper understanding of the supply chain, the key leadership, not just at the top, but who are the engineers that make these missiles? How do they get to different places? Because pressure can be applied not just militarily, it can be applied through the supply chain they use. Because the Houthis, I mentioned, have learned, they've been very smart about how they're acquiring their stuff. They are still getting the high-tech thing from Iran. To be frank, we know how it's getting there. It's pulling into the port of Hudaydah now. There's a uh, there's a United Nations organization called UNVIM that's supposed to inspect all those ships that go in and only make sure humanitarian aid is going in. That's a joke. It's not happening. The ships are going from Iran straight to the port of Hodeidah, and they're unloading, and weapons are getting off there, and they're going into the hands of or key components of weapons. But the Houthis have also learned how to get key components to their weapons elsewhere through the commercial systems. They struggled a little bit with fuel, but they figured out that, and they've also getting a good portion of their technology, and they already have the training from Iran. So, what this campaign, and it's not clear to me it's doing because I don't know, and their administration is not talking about it, but hopefully what it's doing is building up a game plan to get at what the Houthis hold dearest to them, right? And one is Iranian support. The second is their grip on Western Yemen. And it's not assured. It's relatively fragile. They also want to get more control of Marib, and they want to have greater influence in the region. When we start, though, getting right at their grip on power locally, that starts to hurt them. So uh, I'll leave with this. That said, they're still very resilient. Folks that say we'll go in there and take out everyone with the last name of Houthi and we'll win. Their Houthi leadership has been taken out in history in the past, and they are resilient. They came back and they grew stronger. So this isn't something that is a one and done. Ari, hopefully it gets at your answer.
General Costella, does the United States have enough assets and knowledge of Houthi targets in Yemen to continue degrading their capabilities, targeting their leadership over the long term? General Bergeson mentioned earlier the kind of loss of focus on Yemen from the height of counterterrorism operations there. So could you walk through kind of how that targeting would proceed?
Yeah, well, General Bergeson was exactly right when we said, the intelligence is something that, needs to be more to really prosecute the campaign to the extent we could there. It has just been fatigue, I think, and, distractions in other regions, and to include Asia, that consumes a lot of our resources. And it looks like that's changing. And, I will say that this is to answer your question, do we have the assets to do it? Yes, absolutely. The one thing, right at the end of the last administration, if you guys remember, they did a B-2 strikes. Remember that? They actually used the B2s. And I was like, oh, okay, they kind of upped the game here, using, one of our more, capable assets to do that. I thought that was kind of going to be a sign that, hey, that they were going to get after it, but then that kind of subsided. And so the point though is we absolutely do have the assets, but it would mean focusing more into the Middle East, which has just been something during the last administration has just not been willing to do. And the intelligence piece is very important. It involves a lot of collection from overhead. It also, if there's other sources that we need to develop on the ground, and all our intelligence agencies, it requires a focus to really get after it. But as far as do we have the means of the striking? Yes, we do. I will say this though: Houthis have air defenses. We've had multiple drones shot down by the Houthis. We didn't have drones shot down by the Taliban. We didn't have drones and things like that shot down by ISIS. But they're a different adversary, and so it definitely will involve stepping up the game. The something to think about though, and that is in this, because you can never look at these situations in isolation. This is a country, the Houthis have developed through Iran's help the capability of reaching out and holding targets at risk in neighboring countries. They have shot ballistic missiles into Saudi Arabia. They've shot ballistic missiles and a lot of drones into the Emirates, and it really there's risk there to the partners in the regions that don't have sufficient air and missile defenses that Israel does. And so you look at the beautiful city of Dubai and the tourism and all that stuff. So there's a desire, I think, to not allow a lot of escalation regionally here. And so that may be one of the reasons, there's been stuff in moderation. But at some point we have to decide, are we serious about this or not? And I would argue, just like Admiral Donegan said, are we really? This is our, one of our most critical national interests is global commerce, and that's what we've signed up to. It affects the globe. It affects us at home. It affects all of our partners. Are we going to allow this to continue? And so I would say that that we should not. And approaching this differently, which is what we're seeing out of this current administration, is definitely a step in the right direction.
General Bergeson, the Houthis have said they're not going to back down after the U.S. strikes. They responded by launching drones and ballistic missiles against U.S. Navy ships. They've claimed to launch additional strikes as well. They say a lot of things that often aren't true. But where do you see the current operation against the Houthis going from here, and in terms of the Houthis, or let's bring certainly Iran into this? How do you see them responding?
Well, what I hope is that the U.S., and we won't know this because they're not going to publicly announce it, but is now back to intel sharing with the Saudis and the Yemenis that are living in Saudi Arabia that fled from Yemen, because obviously they know the networks and the people way better than we do. They've got that sort of intelligence. There was a prohibition during our time about that kind of intel sharing, again, because I go back to politically, there was no will in the United States to be involved in this. It's seen as a Saudi problem. But I think now I'm hoping that we have that kind of intelligence sharing. Now, you also have to be careful with that, because the Saudis' interest and objectives may be slightly different than what ours are, right? So you always have to be mindful about that. But I think that's what's going to be necessary to be able to prosecute a more impactful campaign to really target key leadership and shut down these networks, which we've done so effectively in counter ISIS and countering violent extremism, et cetera, is being able to build those networks charts and then be able to, tactically take them down. So that's why I hope is happening. I think that will be key. But until we start doing that, I think the Houthis are going to continue to say and bluster, and they probably have plenty of supplies to continue to take pot shots. Now, the effectiveness of those may start to wane as we strike more and more of those targets, but I think they're going to continue to do it. But clearly, I believe that Iran is key here, right? If Iran cuts off, their support to the Houthis, which is not imminent, but that would be very powerful. But until we see progress along those lines, I think, Iran is quite happy to have them, their kind of last remaining effective partner in the region, still take center stage.
As a follow-up, General Bergeson, is countering the Houthis something that you think can be done entirely from the air, or do we need to be finding and supporting fighters on the ground to fight them as well?
I see no prospect of putting U.S. boots on the ground again, and maybe, small teams and those kinds of things, which happen occasionally. But I just don't see that, this president or any other, quite honestly, is going to have the political will to put a ground force on there, because then what are we doing? Do we want to try to take over Yemen? I mean, it's just not a fight we want to get into. So I think severing the ties between Iran and the Houthis to the extent we can is the best bet. And striking, like I've talked about, the networks and the capabilities that they have. But I don't think that we're going to go there. Could be wrong, but I don't see that happening.
General Gustala, Saudi Arabia and UAE's campaign against the Houthis that they waged from 2015 to 2022 was raised earlier. If they didn't have success stopping the Houthis from firing over that period, what can we do differently? How could a more concerted or cooperative campaign with them be more successful?
Well, there's two parts. For starters, their objectives, I think, were different than what ours would be. Our objectives, like was stated, we're not trying to do a regime change there. At least that doesn't seem to be on the table. Nor we boots on the ground occupation. It's really just punishment, and therefore getting them to stop this bad behavior. And so I think the Saudis and the Saudi-led coalition had slightly different objectives as well. But in terms of their capability, is vastly different from the United States. I've always said, you can buy American equipment, but you don't have the capability of the American forces. And so, but the issue for us is really, are we willing to commit the attention and the resources to Yemen? And because we absolutely do have the capabilities. And there, the other piece to it is, and it kind of ties into maybe something farther in the conversation, is, the Houthis are not, like I said, they're not trivial. When they can reach out and touch civilian population centers in the kingdom and in the Emirates and in some of the other countries in the region, that's not risks that they necessarily want to take. And until they have ability to, they can't defend themselves as well as Israel can. Israel's spectacular in terms of its ability to defend themselves against ballistic missiles and drones and things that we've seen tremendous success, despite the incredible volume of fires shot against Israel. Some of the other countries in the region don't have anything close to that. And so as a result, they're somewhat deterred. They're somewhat deterred by the Houthis because of the risks back to them. And so, well, if we were to engage in a campaign of that nature, we would certainly need to put resources in theater. We would need a great deal of maritime components where we're not limited by access, basing, and overflight, and certainly some long range air, and really focus on the region. And I think we on the country itself and on the problem. And I think we could generate some results. But we have to have it. We have to have the desire and that level of ambition.
Just want to remind everyone that you can ask questions by submitting them through Zoom, and want to center the next question on Iran, where it's been raised, but I think is really at the heart of the matter here. So Emerald Donegan, President Trump posted on Truth Social, every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as being shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran, and Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences of those. Suffer the consequences, and those consequences will be dire. Can we make the Houthis stop firing without hitting the Iranians? And if the U.S. were to strike the Iranians, what types of either capabilities or areas in Iran do you think would be most effective at establishing deterrence?
Well, the first answer to that question is yes, we can without hitting Iran, but that's a little bit in Iran's hands because we just talked about, let's say we did stop them from expiring, but if Iran continues their resupply, then you've only got a decrement for a period of time in their capability, if that makes any sense. So in the end, Iran has to agree or in some way stop their support of the Houthis. And it's not just resupply, it's technically, it's advisors, it's how to use these things, it's intelligence that they provide. It's much more than that. And here's the difference, though, Ari. You mentioned the words the president said. When one of the things that Iran has gotten a buy-in, right, is they have not been held accountable directly for the actions of their proxies almost anywhere. And you can look at Iraq, you can look at Syria, you can look at the Houthis, you can look at Hezbollah, you can look at Hamas. We haven't held Iran accountable for the actions of their proxies before. And the POTUS made this president made this statement that's probably deserves a lot of attention and analysis, because he's saying they are going to be held accountable for the actions of their proxies. Now we'll see how that goes. Perhaps that's to work on a future negotiation that he wants to have with Iran. And he's putting that on the table. Not sure, but it's almost this is from a president who struck and killed Soleimani, who was untouchable for quite some time. Now, for those that don't know, Soleimani led the IRGC and the Quds Force. The Quds Force is a subset of the IRGC that specifically supports non-state actors away from Iran. Now, Hamas has been destroyed. Hezbollah has been devastated. Syria is no longer an ally of Iran. Their only real in-region ally. So the Houthis were but that didn't happen because of actions that we took or the rest. That happened for different reasons. But time will tell now if we're going to put meat or on the bones behind what the president said and what the timeline is for that. Hopefully it's not immediate, because as this unfolds, we'll have some time. Now your second part of your question was related to what would we do with Iran? What if we were going to do something in Iran? There's all sorts of, you can imagine, and General Bergeson and Costello know this better than I do. We have a lot of contingency plans related to Iran. Some of them can be done with the support, together with Israel. For instance, their nuclear capability is an option. But specifically in this case, more likely it's going to be something related to the IRGC and the Quds Force and their ability to command and control their forces, their ability to take these non-state actors and give them a potency that can do something like they've given the Houthis, shut down a major waterway. Because I'll go back again just to reiterate what I started with, that the Houthis are not a state actor. They are not a government. They are labeled as a terrorist organization for a reason. By the way, so is the IRGC. We labeled them as a terrorist organization, and the Quds Force. So those are elements of a nation, though, that are doing it. In the case of the Houthis, they're not. So I'm not sure. I think we'll have to pay close attention to where the president takes these remarks. But it will be, holding Iran accountable for the actions of their proxies is long overdue. Now, how we hold them accountable doesn't have to necessarily do with military action either. But there is a lot more that can be done. Maximum pressure campaign was something that this president has done before, and there's talks about upping that up to a different level, and from 1 to 11, and who knows where that could go.
Emerald Donegan, we have a question in from Ryan Lynch. With the renewed focus by this administration on the Houthi problem set, does the DoD, more specifically the Navy, have the readiness to sustain combat operations in the Red Sea and still maintain a credible presence against Russia and China? The use and presence of the CMF has been hesitant to involve themselves in the Red Sea beyond protection of commercial vessels, which lends to this being more a U.S. mission than a coalition mission.
I think everyone on this panel is going to agree with me that, as hard as coalition work is, you do much better as a coalition. Hopefully we can build support, not just from our allies and partners like Europe for what we're doing, but also in the region, right? And part of the reason there was a hesitancy for the regional nations to act is, one is Saudi has a a ceasefire truce agreement with the Houthis, right? And they don't want to have missiles raining down on them. But they're not going to get engaged with the Houthis unless they know we're in it for the long haul. Otherwise, they're left with the problem set of having missiles rain down while they're trying to enact their Vision 2030. And the same thing with the Emirates. So building a coalition, I believe, over time is important, and having a common denominator, a free flow of commerce, is a good one to do it on. And so now to get to your question, I mean, the question was asked is, do we have the readiness to do this and the other problems that we have to engage with around the world? I don't believe this effort will take such a substantial amount of maritime forces that the answer to that would be no. I think the answer is yes, we do, but it's not something that we can just say, I'm going to commit carrier strike groups to the region indefinitely. If we start to do that, then we're going to run into issues, right? Maritime forces, Marine and naval, are inherently maneuver forces. The idea is you don't want to dwell them in one area all the time. You want to engage your allies and partners to give you basing and overflight and things you need to do what you need to do, and not have it solely dependent on maritime forces. And our Navy is not equipped to be doing this all around the globe in multiple places. So it really is a function of for how long that we're going to do this and whether we build that coalition I was talking about.
We also have a question from Colin Demarest. General Bergeson, I'll pose this to you, but welcome anyone to jump in. Is there a risk or concern that this most recent campaign against the Houthis spirals into something without a clear end? What defines success, especially if the group won't stop targeting commercial and military vessels?
$64,000 question. I don't think, as they're currently prosecuting it, that it looks like it's going to spiral out of control. They're trying to be very precise to the extent they can with the target selection and trying to, again, as I was saying, really impose punishments, cost imposing strategy to try to, start mitigating, the capabilities of the Houthis to be able to affect the shipping there. While larger coalition building, international consensus, pressure on Iran to knock this off, kind of is manifesting. So, and again, I don't see us anytime soon making the decision to put like ground forces there to do some sort of a land invasion of Yemen. I just can't see that as a possibility in the near term, at least. Certainly wouldn't be U.S. It could be other coalition members. Maybe it's support of the Saudis. Again, those are all things that are possible. But for right now, it doesn't appear that it's going to spiral out of control. But I think it's going to be, it's not, going to end imminently. It appears like until there's real pressure on Iran, that I don't think it's going to end, quickly. Maybe if there's some sort of a deal that occurs with in Gaza, with the Palestinians, that's been kind of the raison d'etre of the Houthis, at least publicly in Iran, that they're only doing this because they're supporting the Palestinians, right? And we saw that when there was a ceasefire, then the shots, tapered off. So maybe that's something that it's important in the calculus of the Houthis. And I will go back just one quick follow-up on the targeting. I thought the admiral gave a great answer on what should we target in Iran. I think importantly to think about, we, as good military planners, we have every kind of contingency and target set you can dial up, right? To give the president options is what we do. And you try to, think through the consequences. But we do know that at any time that you would strike Iran, specifically, they're going to retaliate. It's going to happen. So you just have to be postured to be able to absorb the second blow, like they did when they fired after we killed Qasem Soleimani and they fired all the missiles at al-Assad. We were able to fortunately move our forces there. The Iranians could claim that they did a retaliation, but no one was killed. But there's vulnerabilities there, right? Fifth Fleet's in Bahrain, in Qatar, just outside of Doha, you have a large presence of U.S. forces. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, they're all nervous about what a potential Iranian response be because they're right there in the neighborhood, and the Arabian Gulf is not very big. So anytime that we talk about, a strike, we always think about setting the theater for the inevitable counterattack that's going to happen, and how do we parry that blow so that it doesn't continue to escalate, right? That's what we're always thinking about.
Hey,
General Costello,
wanted to say
feel free.
yeah, what General Burson said, he's absolutely right. That people talk about Iran being weak now because of the strikes that the Israelis did and taking down air defense and more vulnerable and the status of the economy and such. They may be weak, but they're not they're not without potency. They have still thousands of missiles that they can launch, and those targets that the general mentioned aren't uh, there's not the advantage of time to defend for those nations that he talked about, or our forces in the region that he talked about. So they also have cyber capability. They also have more terrorist capability that they can launch. So there's a lot that Iran can do from the retaliation standpoint. That doesn't mean they necessarily will do it immediately. Also, they have time on their hands when they do it. However, we'll have to see as we go forward how that all plays out. But you have to go into this eyes wide open and understanding what the adversary can do was the point of the general's comments, and I think he's spot on.
General Gastella, we had a question come up on a JINSA webinar yesterday about Iran, but it's directly relevant to this. The question was from Jay Solomon, and it's the strikes that the Houthis have been, or the strikes that the U.S. has been conducting against the Houthis have been coming from strike carrier groups operating in the Gulf, not military assets at Al Udeid. Does Qatar block the Pentagon from using Al Udeid for such operations? And what's the point of having a major base there if we can't use it?
Well, I mean, I can't speak to where all the strikes against Yemen emanate from. I did say earlier, so we use B-2s, so from the U.S. And so obviously some of that is prosecuted from maritime assets. But here's the thing, you're right. When you have a base in someone's country, you have to be granted access, basing, and overflight. And then what you do with your assets, the country gets a vote. And so that is a concern. Like I mentioned before, if you're going to emanate out of the Emirates or Saudi or Qatar, and you're going to possibly elicit a response back into their soil, that's something they have to decide if they're willing to allow to happen. But if you're working together as a coalition with a common purpose to get rid of a common enemy, and you provide those countries with sufficient support in some form of guarantees and security, air defenses, then maybe you'll get that. Maybe you'll get that access. I do know that the Houthis aren't so mean and powerful that we cannot, with the assets that we have, both maritime and I'll just say regionally based, get after it. It is quite possible. I will say this though, man, it is those countries that we have those bases in across the region. They are allies, and having the bases there provides them the sense of security that the U.S. is not going to abandon them and leave them with the mess that's going on. And I always say, it's bad when the U.S. is there. It's worse when we're not. The one thing that's, we saw from the last administration is no one was deterred in that region. What was the most active I've ever seen it in terms of ballistic missile exchanges, drone exchanges, attack on Israel hitting back. It was the Wild West, and it's probably a time where we have some of the least U.S. posture and presence over there. And so, while we do not want to have heel-to-toe carrier deployments and endless 100,000 troop strength parked in the Middle East, the U.S. has to be there to some extent as a deterrent and to show assurances to those allies in the region. I think that's absolutely paramount.
General Bergeson, we have a question from Scott McKean. What lessons should we take from the Saudis' extensive campaign against the Houthis?
War's hard. I don't know It's a great question. Again, in some ways, the Saudis and their little coalition, especially the Emiratis, were fairly effective in their prosecution of their strikes against, and their efforts against the Houthis. I think the Emiratis, we would agree that military, that they were probably the most effective fighting force compared to the Saudis. The Saudis just, without being too pejorative here, there's not really that good. It's hard. It's really hard to do that kind of fine fix finish work, and they're getting better the more they've done at it. But they were largely ineffective. We obviously, I think, just because of the capabilities we have, the experience we have, can prosecute that sort of an air campaign much more effectively. But that alone is probably not going to be that's not going to win this war against the Houthis, if you will. Um, I think that the Saudis have been pushing us to focus on Iran, and I think that we are doing that now publicly, which I think is a very, very important step to pin this. As the Admiral talked about, this is the first time we're really pinning the actions of a Iranian militia to Iran. We didn't do it with Lebanese Hezbollah. We didn't do it with the Iranian militia groups that were operating throughout Iraq when we had explosively formed penetrators coming in from Iran and killing U.S. forces. We didn't put Iran on the spot for that, and we are doing it now. And so I think that's an important step.
Well, we're running up on the end of our time, so I'll just ask if the panelists have any final remarks. General Gastella, I'll start with you.
No, I really think this is a great forum and a fantastic discussion. My fellow panelists are fantastic to work with, and look forward to staying engaged with Ginza.
Great, thank you. Admiral Donegan?
All right, thanks again for letting me join in. I think the way forward here is going to be interesting because we didn't really talk about what the administration is going to do related to Iran deal, right? And clearly, Iran's in a different position than it was before, and every time they've been in a position like this of relative weakness over time, they have gone to the negotiating table. Now they sandbag on the way there and slow things down rather than move forward, but they have gone. So everything's important here. There is opportunity, is the way I want to leave it from that standpoint. Despite what you may hear about the bluster going on back and forth, I think there is opportunity for some kind of deal, and I believe that the Houthi piece can't be pulled apart from that. Some people want to pull it apart, but I think the president just directly put it together.
I think that's an excellent point. That was actually the topic of yesterday's webinar, the Iran deal and the administration's approach to that. But I agree. I think they're certainly linked, and the president made them linked. General Bergeson, any final remarks?
Thanks for the opportunity, and it's really great to be on with the Admiral and Gus as well. Yeah, just one thought, and that what we've seen in the last decade has been a monumental geopolitical shift in the region from the Arab nations sort of aligning against Israel largely to now aligning that Iran is the threat. That is monumental. And I think and the Houthis kind of are helping feed that narrative. We know Gus, when General Costella and the Admiral were in Fifth Fleet and AFCENT respectively, we've always been working on a kind of a common air and missile defense architecture across the region, focused on Iran. And Iran is desperate to not have normalization of relationships between the Arabs and the Israelis. And we were on the precipice of that, obviously, after the Abraham Accords, with then getting a Saudi U.S. security agreement and normalization with Israel. I think that was obviously tabled for a while, but it's probably back on the discussion. And I think that is what Iran really fears, right? They really fear everybody in the region aligning that they are the problem and creating, something like a common air missile defense architecture. There's every justification based on what Iran has been doing with their militia groups for the nations to align on that. But I think that is something they fear. Over.
Thank you to our audience, General Bergeson, General Gastella, and Admiral Donegan, for joining us today. Please join us tomorrow. It's a packed week of GINSA webinars. We have a webinar tomorrow on the resumption of fighting in Gaza, and look out for our next webinar invites in your email inbox as well. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you.